CFL 110, your weekly trip around the biggest stories in the Canadian Football League with Jeff Hamilton and Andrew Hustler Paterson. Presented by Garage Living Winnipeg.
Hey, what's up, CFL fans, and welcome to another playoff edition of CFL 110. Andrew Paterson, Jeff Hamilton with you, and we have a lot to discuss today coming out of the West and East Semi on the weekend and getting ready for Super Saturday in the Canadian Football League with the Argos and Alouettes kicking off in the early game, the East Final, finishing it up with the Bombers and Riders at Princess Auto Stadium in Winnipeg for a trip to BC on the line representing the Western Division. We'll get to that, a look at the awards finalists as well in the Canadian Football League, and a little bit of a look ahead to Grey Cup week in Vancouver. Of course, CFL 110 each and every week is brought to you by our great sponsors at Garage Living Winnipeg. And even though playoff time in November is here, there's no slowing down for the folks at Garage Living Winnipeg. And seems like there's lots of messy garages in and around the city. It is a big problem for some people. I spoke with our pal Pat Kanuga from Garage Living the other day. He was in a 5-year-old home in a new neighborhood, and the owners had never parked in their garage before because it's so full of stuff. Well, Garage Living Winnipeg can help fix those problems and give you an organized garage with a place for everything. It's your chance to clear the clutter, organize and beautify your garage with slat wall, polyaspartic floor coatings, and made in Canada premium metal cabinetry. Check out their website at garageliving.com for tons of videos and examples of the incredible work they've done to completely revolutionize customers' garages. And give Pat Kanuga a call at 204-999-1234 to book a free in-garage consultation, or make an appointment to meet him at the showroom at 981 Main Street. Garage Living Winnipeg. Garage is made for living. Again, 999-1234 is the number for more information or to set up that free in-garage consultation with our pal Pat Kanuga. All right, Hammer, we are down to 3 more games remaining in the CFL season. It's kind of hard to believe. I remember us starting this show on week number 1, and yet here we go. The East and West final and a trip to Vancouver for the Grey Cup next week on the line.
Man, I already feel like I'm in Vancouver with all the work that I've been doing leading up to the Grey Cup week. I am the president of the Football Reporters of Canada, and I've taken over a couple different roles within the group, and that includes all the preparation. So I feel like I've been on the phone talking about breakfast, talking about so many different things. I'm already kind of feeling like I'm in Grey Cup mode, but here we are at the finals weekend, we can refer to it as. It's exciting matchup. It's the 4 teams that we pictured being in these finals, so I don't think there's any surprises. But we'll get to the games and how the teams got there and where we think they're headed. But yeah, this is crunch time, man. We got to be at our best, and we will be.
Well, listen, all these teams are going to need to be on their best on Saturday afternoon. Let's start with last weekend, and let's start with the East. Certainly for folks in the West and on the prairies, the main event is one they've been waiting for a long time. But this matchup, Jeff, in a lot of ways, has been a year in the making. And Montreal was at home. They knew that they'd be playing in the East Final. It was the Toronto Argonauts this year who had the opportunity to book their ticket for a rematch of that disappointing East Final for them last year. Argos and Redblacks was an interesting game. Ottawa got up to a 10-0 lead. They actually had a halftime lead, although a very strange play cut that halftime lead in half right at the buzzer. But in the second half, it was the Argos flexing their muscles and showing an all-around game that really, at the end, kind of blew Ottawa out of the water. Now, they put 44 up offensively. The 2 late defensive touchdowns made this look like more of a blowout than it really was. I give Ottawa a lot of credit. They were actually better than I thought they'd be. I thought they came out ready, prepared. But I think in the end, through 60 minutes, we saw the better football team come up on top.
Yeah, let's start with Ottawa. A couple different things. We've been saying for weeks, Huss, that if the Redblacks had a chance to get to the East Final, that Drew Brown would have to have a game. There was no situation, no scenario that I was envisioning when we said that he would be stepping back and trying to pass 61 times. That was, wild. To me, was just clearly, with the absence of a true and trusted running back on offense. We also talked about that. We talked about Raquel Armstead leaving the team weeks ago to personality, attitude issues, and they just never were able to find a replacement, nor did it seem like they were all that interested looking to the outside. I mean, they got Braylon Addison to be the runner in that game, a guy who excelled as a receiver. I don't think he led the Redblacks in yards. He did eclipse 100, but he was the guy who was leaned on for the run game. Now, Tommy Condell did some creative things to make up for the absence of a true running game. He did have some sweet passes. There were some jet stuff. There were some creativity there, but when you are stepping back and passing as much as the Redblacks were, it just allows for the Toronto Argonauts to pin their ears back and go all hell loose on you. And I have to give credit to Ottawa's offensive line. I thought they played pretty well in this game, giving Drew Brown enough time to throw 61 pass attempts. I believe he completed 46, which is a CFL record. So credit there by the offense. Just a couple things that got away from them. You can't hide the fact that the defense cost the Redblacks this game. They allowed Chad Kelly to have a perfect passer rating. He completed 18 of his 20 passes, and that's not a lot of pass attempts. Obviously, 1/3 that the Ottawa attempted, and he still lit it up for like 350-something yards. It just seemed like every time he had the time and space to find his receiver, it wasn't some of the short stuff. He was testing them deep, and you just have to look at the end of that, really that first half. Redblacks played great. As you mentioned, they had a 3-point lead at halftime, but there was no finish. In that first half, there was just no finish, and that speaks to the Ottawa Redblacks all season long. This is the team who finished with touchdowns just over 40% of the time that they got into the red zone. That was a league worst, and that reared its ugly head again in this one. They were able to get 2 touchdowns in the first half, but 5 of their 6 possessions in that first half entered the red zone, and only 2 touchdowns to show for it. 3 field goals by Lewis Ward as well. Then, when you don't score touchdowns and you as Zach Collaros likes to call, as he referred to at the end of that game against Montreal in the regular season finale, you got to finish with 7s. You can't finish with 3s. And while they were finishing with 3s to close out that half, Toronto wasted no time. It was the time of possession in the first half was over 24 minutes in favor of Ottawa. That gives Toronto
insane number
minutes. And what do? He hammers a 70-yarder downfield to Polk for a touchdown, followed by a 41-yarder touchdown to Devarius Daniels. Those drives each one of them lasted fewer than a minute. And so when you add in the fact that they tried to squib kick to close out that first half, and it just, obviously messed up. This was not an onside kick attempt, I think was the confusion in the broadcast. No, this was a preventing the ball from being in the arms of Janarian Grant. Instead, hit the chest of the guy in the top line, setting up for a field goal with 0s left on the clock to cut it to a 3-point game. That, to me, Huss, was the start of the end for Ottawa. It just, when I saw Devarius Daniels come out of that first half and do his on-field interview with TSN and talk about how the real team was going to show up in the second half, that's exactly what we saw. We saw Toronto take over. We saw Ottawa limited to these dinky-dunky passes. There wasn't a lot of deep threats, and we saw Toronto, particularly Chad Kelly, and we'll get into him when we talk about that East Final, play the lights out. And when it all comes down to it, Ottawa didn't play all that bad. They just didn't play good enough to win.
Yeah, that play at the end of the first half was, listen, I know you look at the final score and say, well, they put up a 50-burger. I mean, how much did it matter? No, it mattered. I mean, they had that late touchdown. They were up by 6 points on the road, probably feeling they were in a really, really good spot. And you have that, unfortunate play that Squibbs turns into a shot for Hairolahu within field goal range at the buzzer, and you just basically give a free 3 points and you cut that lead in half before you even get to the dressing room. I thought that was a huge boost for Toronto. And listen, when you see the way the game went, again, Toronto didn't completely run away with it. Like, Ottawa did hang in there. They were in that game in the fourth quarter, but you add in those extra points, the fact, to your very accurate observation, that they weren't efficient enough in the red zone like the Argos were. And it was just a mistake that they could not afford to make. But in the end, the Toronto Argonauts were the better team. We expected them to win, and they did in pretty convincing fashion, along with some real highlights there on those defensive touchdowns at the end of the game. But, Jeff, we get the matchup we all thought we were going to get. Montreal and Toronto in the East Final. A complete reversal of last year, where Toronto was the team all season long that was in first place. They knew they were hosting this game for the better part of 2 months leading into it. And Chad Kelly had the worst day of his professional career and turned the ball over so many times that the Montreal Alouettes had a cakewalk in there. It's a fascinating setup in that, we've kind of telegraphed this and realized that the Argos, considering Kelly missed the first half of the season, where their defense has been playing in the second half, but especially as of late, and how their offense is humming. And on the other side, the Montreal Alouettes that have been sort of just waiting to get to the playoffs after coming up to that big lead. This is a scenario where I really think this is sort of a pick'em, and it is impossible to talk about this game without talking about what happened a year ago when these two teams went head-to-head, with the Argos the heavy favorite.
We'll see how much of that breakdown from Chad Kelly will play in this game. I will say 0. I think he exercised those demons with the East semifinal victory here. I mean, he was close to perfect, right? He had a perfect passer rating. When you complete 90% of your passes, eclipse 300 passing yards and throw for 4 touchdowns. And that's not even considering the rushing touchdown and the 2 runs, I believe he got for 29 yards in the game. So he also had an impact in the run game. Look, not a huge fan of Chad Kelly off the field. Obviously, I feel like I've been listening to a lot of podcasts here, and you need to preface it by saying that. But he is the guy who will be the reason that the Argos either make it to the Grey Cup or don't make it to the Grey Cup. Because we see when Chad Kelly is on, he is tough to stop. The Toronto Argonauts offense is playing at a level that few other offenses in this league are playing. Is certainly the most potent offense currently in the playoffs right now, and that's a dangerous ingredient. When you factor in the defense, the level of pressure rate that the Toronto Argonauts D-line gets on opposing quarterbacks, and this is a scary team. This is a team that is, as we mentioned last week, as I mentioned on your show on Winnipeg Sports Talk on Monday, there's a lot of things to look at the Toronto Argonauts and what we've seen, not just this past game where they handily defeated the Ottawa Redblacks, but really over the last month, this is a team that is playing the right kind of football, has weapons in all 3 phases, and can hurt you if you don't bring, as Willie Jefferson loves to say, your A game against them. That's just the facts. Here's the thing, Huss, and I said this last week, I'm not buying into the hype that this is going to be an Argos, redemption story from last season. I think people are sleeping on the Alouettes. I think people are looking at the last month of their play and looking at them almost like an easy out, not taking into consideration whatsoever that this team locked up the East Division well in advance and was able to do whatever they wanted to do over the last month of football, including giving rest to quarterback Cody Fajardo an extra few days after the birth of his child, playing Davis Alexander more, having their depth tested in different places. I just look at that last game in the regular season, Huss, and if we're going to assume that the Winnipeg Blue Bombers aren't a pushover, I think that's safe to assume right now, the way they played against Winnipeg in a game that meant nothing to them outside of getting a better mojo heading into the playoffs, I think this is going to be a really dangerous team. It's going to be, they got 2 good quarterbacks. I don't think they have a great one yet, but if Cody Fajardo isn't playing well or isn't executing to what Jason Moss wants him to, I don't think there will be a big hesitation to go to Davis Alexander. You look at Noel Thorpe's defense. The one big takeaway for me when it came to Ottawa's defense, as I mentioned in the last segment, they're the ones that cost them the game. What Ottawa was able to do was get some pretty good licks on Chad Kelly, including one, Ormalade, I hate pronouncing his name, forced a fumble. So there was something in the scheme, in Toronto's scheme, that was exploitable to get to Chad Kelly, and I think that is going to be key for Montreal. Of course, that's going to be key for Montreal because the defense has been the bread and butter of Montreal all season long. So if they can get in to Chad Kelly's kitchen, if they can throw him some, disguised looks, really mess with them, I think that is Montreal's chance. And this is the other thing. They're playing in Montreal. So Toronto had the luxury of hosting the Ottawa Redblacks, didn't have to deal with the crowd noise, didn't have to deal with that added element of difficulty to their offense. And anyone who's been to Molson Stadium knows that they allow those air horns. That's going to be an added challenge for this offense. So it's not going to be as easy. And I'll finally go to my last point, one I've been making for weeks now, is count out the Alouettes at your own risk when you give head coach Jason Moss enough time to plan for his opponent. This guy reminds me a lot of Mike O'Shea. They are going to be prepared. They are going to be motivated, and they are going to be ready. And at this point in time, I do believe it will be a close game, but I'm not jumping on the boat, man. I'm going to the Alouettes to punch their ticket to a second straight Grey Cup, and we'll see what happens after that.
Yeah, listen, you did a great job of laying it out. It is a fascinating matchup. And I think that, we often live in, a world of recency bias. What did the team do last week? I mean, oh, yeah, they were playing really well. And you sort of sometimes lose sight of the bigger picture. And the bigger picture, as you mentioned, is the Montreal Alouettes have been planning for this day for the better part of 2 months. Now, that was the same case with the Argos last year, and we saw the way that it worked out. But your point of Noel Thorpe and Jason Moss having that extra week to prepare, pretty sure they had a pretty good idea that they'd be playing Toronto when they finished that game against the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. And, without disrespecting Ottawa, probably spent a little bit more time on the double blue than they did in that extra week of preparation. They certainly have a defense that, is going to be well prepared and ready to go for a team that they're very familiar with. To me, this is, Chad Kelly, you can talk about exercising the demons or that he's done it already. If he doesn't come up and have a big game against that Montreal defense, I think they are going to have a long afternoon. Mm-hmm. But I actually really focus on the two defenses in this game. What Noel Thorpe has for the Argos and what the Argos are able to do, particularly on the line of scrimmage. We saw Toronto come in and terrorize Zach Collaros a few weeks ago, getting 7 sacks. And if they're able to consistently get into the backfield and rush Cody Fajardo or Alexander if he makes it into the game at any point, I think it really swings the pendulum in the favor of the Argos. It's cliche to say that we're going to see what both teams are made of on the line of scrimmage, but I really do think that is something that we might talk not enough about, but truly will be a deciding factor in the game, in addition to if either of these teams can also add in the running game to the aerial attack. Last week there wasn't a lot of that whatsoever, and it really was on Chad Kelly, and we'll see whether he's ready for the Bright Lights of the East Final. I'm sure he remembers what happened last year, but you cannot dwell on it. But it is an opportunity for him to prove that, he was the MOP last year. He had a bad day, but he's ready to go. I'm with you, though. I think this is going to be an incredibly close game. I think we'll be glued to the televisions late into the fourth quarter. And you know what? Listen, we'll go head-to-head on this one. I will take the Argos in this game.
You better. You've been pumping the Argos for a while now.
Well, yeah. Listen, I think they've trended very well, and we've seen over and over again that I'd far rather a team that plays well late going into the playoffs than a team that really hasn't had to play for it. And that's not disrespecting Montreal by any stretch. I do think that they're really well coached and they will be prepared. I just think that we're seeing an Argo team that is peaking at the right time. We saw what they did to Ottawa last week, and I do think this is going to be a big, big challenge for the Montreal Alouettes. Moving over to the west side of things, the game that we were both really looking forward to last week delivered. BC was certainly a better challenge for the Rough Riders than they were a few weeks ago when they came in and got absolutely blown out in a game that determined where that game would be. And it was actually a pretty nice start for BC as well. But like often happens, and like what happened, I think, in the West semi, as the game went on and more ticks went off the clock, you saw the better team execute and establish their superiority over their opponent. And listen, Vernon Adams was a gamer, and I thought that BC did a lot of things that, kept them in the game. But the longer it went, the more you saw the Saskatchewan defense step up and really start feeling themselves. And I got to tell you, man, which brings us into our next conversation about this Saturday, Trevor Harris in the second half of this season has been playing as well and as confidently as any quarterback in the Canadian football. You put together a championship level defense, the weapons, the running game that they have now as well. The Riders are no joke, and the BC Lions just weren't able to match up with them, although making a game of it and keeping it close into the second half.
Almost similar to the Ottawa game in the way that the BC Lions were actually, like, you look statistically, were good. They just weren't great. And you need to be great if you're going to go into Mosaic Stadium and beat a Riders team that is incredibly motivated to get to the Grey Cup, is in playing in front of 30,000 of their Wild fans. And it just wasn't enough. It was almost a nice, tidy window into their entire season, Huss. Look, this team clearly didn't recover since the Vernon Adams injury / signing of Nathan Rourke. And while I do think they made the right decision down the stretch to go to Vernon Adams, you saw Vernon Adams play kind of like vintage Vernon Adams. I mean, he eclipsed 300 passing yards. He found the end zone a couple times, but he also got picked off 3 different times, right? And there was one in particular late to Marcus Sales where you just didn't know where else the ball was aimed at. I mean, it was just a bad throw. And, to hear some of the comments after, like I said, we'll get to the Riders, but to hear some of the comments afterwards from Vernon Adams talk about how he was crushed, like really open up about his feelings of not being given that opportunity to return to the lineup after he got healthy. Obviously, after they signed Nathan Rourke, didn't like that. And I think it's put the organization in a little bit of shaky ground, for lack of a better term. Head coach Rick Campbell still has one more year on his deal. Will he be back in BC? Did he handle it enough to keep his job? The fact of the matter is, BC's next to the Winnipeg Blue Bombers has had the most continuity from year to year after the last few seasons, and they clearly regressed this year. So there's going to be massive change in BC. There's no doubt about it. Whether that will turn into a coaching change or personnel change, whether that's on offense or defense. Ryan Phillips is a respected defensive coordinator, but BC's defense was their Achilles heel all season long. They were just too weak at pressure on the quarterback, which opened up and exposed their secondary. It's just a bad look. So BC, a lot of questions heading into the offseason, disappointing ending to a year where obviously they're hosting the Grey Cup and envisioned, president and owner Amar Doman envisioned being there by the end of the year. So, disappointing things going on. But as you mentioned, Huss, it was the Riders. It was the Riders that found their stride at the end of the game. It was the Riders that came up with big plays when it mattered the most. It was the Riders that put the finishing stamp on a game when it needed to. And while the score looked close, it really was in Saskatchewan's hands for much of that second half. And I feel like, much like Toronto, you have a Riders team that's going to be riding that momentum into the West Final here, beating a confusing BC Lions team, to say the least.
Yeah, well, listen, I mean, I'll look forward to kind of diving into the BC situation next week when we talk about all sorts of storylines in and around the Canadian Football League, in addition to the Grey Cup game between the winners of the two games this weekend. But yeah, listen, I thought Vernon brought some jump. I thought he played quite well at times, but there's just no way that you can go on the road against a quality team like Saskatchewan and commit those number of mistakes and win the football game unless those favors are returned, and they weren't. This is probably about as good of a compliment as I can give the Riders, and their fans might not like it, but it kind of reminded me of the Bombers over the last 4 years, a team that, not necessarily running away and blowing teams out, but as the game continues on, they make the adjustments, tighten up defensively, and continue to do what they do best, and that is move the football and control the football, especially with a powerful ground game that changes the equation come November. They were the better team. They were the favorite in the game. I thought that the game would be relatively close. It was kind of close, but at the end, in the final 5 minutes of the game, the Riders had it. You move a few first downs, you get the hell off the field, and you get planning for the next one. And this is what we thought we were going to get. I think what most people on the prairie certainly hoped we were going to get. And now we get a fourth and final meeting in the West Final between the Saskatchewan Roughriders and the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. Bombers 2-1 on the season in the head-to-head matchup, losing 19-19 earlier in the season, and then a 2-point win on the road in the Labor Day Classic, a 5-point win at home in the Banjo Bowl. This game opened at 4.5. It's at 3.5 right now. And I thought Bob Knuckles Irving said it very well on Twitter. The only thing that would surprise me is if this game isn't close and isn't tight right down to the end. I would argue that this Rider team, where they're at right now, is as evenly matched up with the Bombers as they've been in probably 5, 6, 7 years, Jeff. And it sets up just an absolutely awesome matchup that is going to be loud. The atmosphere is going to be incredible at Princess Auto Stadium. Two teams that don't like each other playing when the stakes are the highest.
I'll piggyback on one of your final points there, is that the Saskatchewan Roughriders finally lived up to their end of the deal here, right? They're a solid team again after 2 years of playoff list football. Got to give a ton of credit to Corey Mace, obviously, for getting his team to this point and pushing for top spot in the West. He's nominated for Coach of the Year out of the West, so he'll be up for that award, and rightfully so, and navigated this team through a 7-game winless streak that ultimately started with the back-to-back losses to Winnipeg, right? So or didn't start with them, but was part of that, right? And so this is a team that has gone through a lot, right? They've been battle tested. They've gone through the success of a success of a season with a hot start and leading the West for a fair amount of time early on. Then they went through, as I mentioned, that 7-game winless streak. And throughout that whole process, it was Corey Mace hammering home the messaging of staying committed to the process. You want to talk about similarities to the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. Perhaps there was nothing more similar between the two organizations than when Mike O'Shea was in that situation with the Bombers, trying to get them over the top, trying to trust within that process. And you're seeing a quick turnaround from them, obviously. But in this game, Huss, you look at some of the season previews, you look at some of the season series. You mentioned the 19-9 close. That was the Riders actually outscored Winnipeg this season when you take into consideration that 10-point margin of victory in the first game, right? As you mentioned, 2 points and 5 points in the other two. But that first game, for instance, Zach Collaros didn't play in the second half. So the Bombers did pretty well to hold on to that game. And, I mentioned that, I make a big deal about the Riders being a good team. And you talked about how they've, become one of those top teams in the West. It doesn't really matter what the records are when these two teams play. It doesn't matter what's happening. It matters that it's in Winnipeg, and that's going to be a massive advantage for the Bombers as they try to punch their ticket to another Grey Cup. But these teams, something always wild happens. I'm going to beat that drum to death. It's just it's unpredictable. It's like almost as if to use a hockey analogy, it's like both teams enter the game gripping the stick a bit too hard, and you're just waiting for something crazy to happen, a mistake to happen, a breakdown to happen somewhere to turn the game on its head. So I'm with Knuckles. I thought that 4.5 point favorite was bizarre, because it just feels, it doesn't sound like a lot of points, but it just feels like a ton, because whenever these two teams get together, it's always a battle. It's always a close affair. And when you ramp up the stakes, like a ticket to the Grey Cup on the line, Huss, I mean, we're going to see that hatred go to a whole new level. I'm really intrigued to see how the Bombers come out in this one. I'm not going to paint it as the Bombers will only, can only beat themselves, but I wonder, after all the success that they've had this year, I mentioned about the Riders going through a lot. Well, the Bombers went through a lot this season, obviously. How can they take some of the lessons learned this season, try to find that, that extra edge, right? That motivation to push back and to punch your ticket to the Grey Cup, because it's going to be a tall order here. It's going to be a tall task with Saskatchewan. Trevor Harris is playing. Trevor Harris, Bo Levi Mitchell, I was talking to Farhan Lalji about this earlier, and they've kind of changed the whole landscape of the quarterbacks in the CFL. All these guys that we thought were going to be maybe one step, two steps out of the league are very much entrenched. And Trevor Harris, there's nobody better at reading opposing defense. There's no one that's seen more. Jordan Younger was defensive coordinator for the Bombers, was talking about it this week. He was teammates with Trevor Harris at one point. So it just goes to show just how much experience Trevor Harris has. And the other thing I'll add to it, Huss, is that run game. Right, this is a team. We talked about the lack of run games. There's a commonality between those two teams that lost in the semifinals. Both couldn't establish the run game. The Riders have AJ Ouellette back. It seemed a bizarre usage of him this season. It looked like they were running him to the ground through the first month, 6 weeks. Well, they did that, and he got a long layoff to recover. Didn't blow the doors out of the game this past weekend, but was effective in his runs. Scored twice on the ground. Raquel Armstead, that the guy who would have fought for the lead in rushing out of Ottawa before the disciplinary or attitude issues. He's there as a backup if AJ Ouellette needs the relief or rest. They've had them both on the field at the same time. This one is going to be a tough one. It's going to be a challenging one. The thing that I'm going to be looking for mostly in this one, Huss, is Buck Pierce and the offense. I want to see the Winnipeg Blue Bombers not just lean on Brady Oliveira. That is going to have to be an important element of it. We know how good the Riders are in the run game, but they need to open up shots downfield. It can't be all this dinky dunk stuff that we seem to get from the Winnipeg Blue Bombers every time it turns November. We need Zach Collaros to be testing the Riders downfield. I know they're great at takeaways. They can't be scared. They need to be doing their own thing. We saw a bit in Montreal. I'm hoping that is a sign of more to come here, because that's going to be the difference in my mind, is getting Zach Collaros to dial some up. What are you looking for in this one?
You know what? It is, I mean, like you lay it out too when you think about the season series. 3 games, 180 minutes, 3 points deciding between the two, albeit the Bombers, with their knack for finding a way to win, actually winning 2 of the 3 games. To me, there's a few things that I'll be looking for. And like right off the top, as I say, to me, I think this game really is a toss-up. I think that these teams are so evenly matched, in similar areas as well. There's a couple things that it probably comes down to. If you tell me that one team wins the turnover battle, I'm telling you that team is very likely to win. That won't always be the case.
You didn't watch the 2021.
Yeah,
that's final.
This is so different. But
you're right, totally.
To me, this team is so different from that. I was actually going to say, if somebody turns the football over 5 times in the first half, it's over. Because the offenses will get it done. That Bomber defense was at such a higher level than Saskatchewan. They kept giving them, the Bomber offense gave them chance after chance after chance, and they got nothing. And then all of a sudden, going into the dressing room at halftime, you're down 3 points after giving the ball away 5 times. I think the Bombers knew that they had that game. That isn't going to cut it this time. And I think whichever offense takes care of the football better will have a big leg up, and we'll see what happens on the defensive side of the football, because both of these units have taken advantage of mistakes on the side of the other units and have made big impactful plays. I think special teams is going to be a big part of it. You mentioned the weird things coming. I mean, a massive return, missed field goals that should go in when you need the points. Much like the Labor Day game. I mean, Sergio Castillo banging a 60-yarder. What's the difference in the football game at the end of it, and a missed 2-point convert? So there's a number of things, like legitimately singular plays, that could be the difference for winning and losing. So all of that being taken for granted, to me, the line of scrimmage and that battle between the defensive and offensive lines on both teams, I think, is going to be absolutely maybe the difference maker. I mean, the Bombers need to be able to protect Zach Collaros. We saw what happens to the Bomber offense when they played Toronto, when they were in the backfield all the time. I mean, that they have to be able to give Zach time, and at the same time, establish Brady Oliveira running the football to open up more of that downfield passing, and not just, to your point, 6 and 7 and 8 yard plays and just move the chains. Although at times you'll take what the defense will give you. Yep. But I think Saskatchewan is good enough, and they're playing at a high enough level on offense that the Bombers are going to need to score some points. Like, I don't see this game being a 13-11 game, especially when you look at the weather forecast. Expected to be a high of 13 degrees and sunny on Saturday. Now, this game will kick off after the sun goes down, but it'll still be relatively warm and night and day from
not
what
that it
these
matters to these two sides anyways, you know?
No, not at all. But I do think that, you know, if all of a sudden you have really extreme cold, I think at that point, the passing game is a little more challenging. I think these quarterbacks are going to be slinging it. I know Trevor Harris is going to.
Exactly.
But to me, you know, the test of who can win those battles more often than not on the line of scrimmage to help establish the run, and most importantly, give these two quarterbacks time to throw the football, to me being the difference. Like, I'm going to take the Bombers. I'm not taking them. Like, I'm not even touching the point spread in this game because, as I said, I fully expect this game to be a 1, a 2, a 3-point game. And to me, this comes down to two things. The environment, the home field, the extra week of preparation, I think, is a big advantage for Winnipeg. And listen, they've been here before. They know what it takes to win in this situation. They've done it 4 straight times. Saskatchewan, I don't want to say, like, they kind of are playing with house money. I'm sure they would say, well, they wouldn't take that. They're here to do a job. But I do think, like we saw the Bombers in previous seasons before they actually got over the hump, this team has come so far this year. You know, maybe there'll be a lesson learned or two if they don't get the win, and it makes them even better for next season. But I'm going to take the Bombers in a real tight one. But as I say, you know, to your point, whether it's a special teams play, one poor decision throwing the football, that could completely change it. And these teams are even enough that anything that we just listed could be the difference between winning and losing.
Chris Cole, I'll leave last word for Bombers center Chris Kolonkowski. When I asked him about that, he called it a mutual hatred for one another on the field, and he called it the most beautiful thing you can have in a game. And what you get, what you most look forward to, is that feeling. Like, you know, I know hate is kind of a, you know, no one hates the guy personally. It's just this fierce wanting for violence in the trenches. And Chris, when I asked Chris Kolonkowski about it, I mean, he said again that there was a mutual hate for one another. But he said when it comes to these two teams, you know, especially when it comes to the playoffs, that you try to you straddle the line as much as you possibly can. And when you do that, quote unquote, shit happens, and he's expecting all of that and more to happen in this game. So you got two lines, as you mentioned, Tuss. You got two offensive lines. You got two defensive lines that love to play aggressive, love to be physical, and love to muck it up. And those always make for the most heated and best games to watch. And this one will be, I expect, nonetheless. I will say one more thing on Corey Mace. It's really often that you talk about the players. And I think, you know, not that I hadn't thought about it, but you bring up a really great point when it comes to experience. And it is an interesting situation because if you look at the Riders' year under first-year head coach Corey Mace has done a couple things like a rookie head coach. And so, you know, he's made some mistakes when he's trying to manage, you know, the defense and play calling and clock management, all those things. There's a lot to have to handle. And he's messed up a couple times this season already. And so I wonder, when you tell your players, make sure that the moment doesn't get too big for them. I think that applies to Corey Mason in this situation. Now, I'm not suggesting that it will get too big for him. I think he's a composed guy, very level-headed, but he's got to make sure for him that this moment doesn't get too big and that he's focused as much as his player. It's going to matter a lot to beat a team.
Listen, that's a great point, and I will extend that to the players. I mean, these games sometimes do get nasty. I think composure and discipline, which has always been the bread and butter of the Blue Bombers, and it has been far from it in Saskatchewan up until this season, and even still, that's been an issue at times for them. I mean, those are all some of those little things. That 15-yard penalty can be the difference between a punt and Sergio Castillo going out and blasting a 52-yarder and winning the game. And I will say this, if it does come down to special teams, the return game will be big, but I certainly do, in a big moment, from distance like Sergio Castillo more than Brett Lauther. It's going to be awesome. Cannot wait for both of these games this weekend, especially 5:30 down at Princess Auto Stadium. Now, I want to get to the awards in a second, but very quickly, and I know this will be another big topic next week with the off-field stuff at Grey Cup weekend. The latest on the Elks. So Chris Morris, longtime member of the team, 230 games as, then Eskimo, but now Elk. He's now the new president. Great press conference, a lot of energy. I mean, this is a guy, that's the sort of the message that you want, but the job is just starting now. The plan is to hire a GM who will then hire a head coach. They hope to do it by the week after the Grey Cup. What did you make of the hire and just how things are looking at Edmonton as they try to get this team back to a level of respectability they haven't had through the Chris Jones era?
Look, I love what Morris did in his debut at first press conference. He brought the energy, right? He brought that passion that you want to hear. I mean, you need more than just words. Actions will ultimately determine the success that he has in that current role, but you want to hear that stuff. You want to hear about how passionate he is about this organization. You want to hear things like the turnover isn't going to be as great as it has been over the last few seasons. I don't know if he's taking a dig at Chris Jones when he's saying that, but he must be, right? Whether that's players, whether that's people. I think he wants to create a certain pride of working and being part of this organization, something that's been lost through the Chris Jones era, and most importantly, through all the losing that the Elks have faced over the last X amount of years here. So I did like the introductory press conference. I am curious about what happens next year. We'll get into that in a later show when all those things are decided upon, but it will be interesting to see what he's put a date here, a deadline here of a week past Grey Cup to have a head coach and general manager. I don't know why you set timelines like that or deadlines like that to me. I mean, you either know who you have, but that's only a few weeks away here to get this job done. Another thing I found interesting, a little off topic here, but the buzz was that, so this was the former head coach of the University of Alberta Golden Bears, this Morris guy, and apparently went in to talk to Lachera, Rick, the interim president, about the 50-50 and the money that was going to be going to the university or whatever, the take home or whatever. And I heard that he was so impressed with that meeting that's why he hired him. Like, he wasn't even applying for the job, which I think is a wild but awesome story. Now his job is to find the right people who want to be here, who want to turn this organization around, starting with the GM. And I don't know about Geroy Simon and Jarius Jackson, the two guys holding their respective interim titles at GM and head coach right now, if they've done enough to salvage that role. I know I'm hearing they bring a different energy, with what they brought as the main men in those roles away from Chris Jones. Again, whether that's enough, I'm not sure. I just have this feeling that it's going to go to Ed Hervey. That's the buzz that's happening. Ed Hervey, obviously, I believe, he's assistant GM. He's got the opportunity to come over and be, return to a team that he once, took over in the same role. Excuse me, I don't know why I'm getting a word salad there, but that's the vibe, that's the feeling, and that kind of would align with things as far as the timeline, because I just don't think there's a lot of time from here to now. If you wanted to talk to say a Ted Gavaya or a Danny McManus. You could, the two assistant general managers from Winnipeg. I guess you could have those conversations over Grey Cup. You certainly couldn't have that conversation with Buck Pierce if that's somebody you're interested with. So that would, if someone he was interested, if the Elks are interested in, that would have to happen after the Grey Cup. So, it will be an interesting process here. One of the names, I wanted to save it. We'll talk about it in a later show, but may Rick Campbell be somebody who's potentially up for an Elks job? And I just want to float that out there as somebody who obviously is the son to Hugh Campbell, the head coach of those dynasty years. And while he does have a year remaining in his contract with the BC Lions, might owner Amar Doman want to find a change in direction? Maybe Rick Campbell, now his comments, his post-game press comments suggest that he wants to be there, and he's believable when he says it. But whether or not the BC Lions will want him there will be an interesting situation. Might he find himself in a position to be available, and how fitting would that be to maybe get a job with the Elks? That's all speculation at
maybe
this
the
point.
Maybe the Elks can trade VA and Rick Campbell.
That was my next thought. I wanted to. I didn't have my tinfoil hat on firm enough to suggest that maybe that would be but we also know that Rick Campbell's attached to Nathan O'Rourke as well, right? I mean, it was him that trusted him after Mike Riley to go with him as a starter when everybody thought that he was crazy, but we also know he's a big VA guy, right? And so anyways, that could all prove to be nothing, but it is interesting times in Edmonton, and dare I suggest positive times after what's been a few down.
They need it. They absolutely need it. The organization, the league needs it. That's a crown franchise of this league, and it's fallen off so badly over the course of the last few seasons. You'd like to see that thing get turned in the right direction, get some more asses in the seats, and get the team playing a more respectable brand of football. Hammer, next week when we are in Vancouver for the Grey Cup, there'll be all sorts of hype and talk about the big game. There'll also be the awards. We do have the finalists for all the CFL awards. We'll just do a quick rundown here. MOP, Brady Oliveira, Bo Levi Mitchell. Listen, might be a little biased being here. Brady has been the catalyst of this Bombers turnaround, along with the real stock defense. And listen, Bo did a lot of great things this year, but I just have a hard time imagining a guy on a team that he was benched at one point this season. They were never really competitive as far as the landscape of the league after that horrible start. Didn't make the playoffs when 3 of the 4 teams in the East made the playoffs. Not to mention Brady having such a great season last year. I think that helps him. I'd be stunned if Brady Oliveira does not win the most outstanding player.
Yeah, that would be surprising to me too. Kudos to Bo Levi Mitchell, who a lot of people wrote off heading into this season. He had an up and down year, to say the least. Almost lost his starting job, and then threw for more than 5,000 passing yards and led the league for the first time in his career in that category. But I'm with you, not enough to show for it. He is advocating. I don't think that's going to work. He really wants to get it, but I'm with you. To me, it's a Brady Oliveira award. I probably should have won it last year. Definitely think he is the clear front runner this season. The
outstanding defensive player comes down to Roland Milligan Jr. from the Riders and Tyrese Beverett from the Montreal Alouettes. And I will put my hand up and I will say that I think many people have sometimes been guilty a little bit of the Western bias. I probably see more games out of the West, although try to watch all of the games. With what Montreal was doing, the way they were rolling teams, really didn't get into the minutia of how they were doing it. And I kind of thought that Roland Milligan was going to be a runaway winner for this award. And then you dive in a little bit to Beverett's the stats for the year. First in the league in defensive plays with 137. Milligan was 111. 102 defensive tackles, breaking the 100 mark and ranking 4th in the league. Tied for 2nd in the league with 8 tackles for a loss, trailing only Isaac Ademi-Berglund, who's up against Brady Oliveira for most outstanding Canadian. The more I dive into this, I think being fair, this is very much of a toss-up right now. I mean, do you have a lean right now? I'm not sure if you've already put your vote in, but how do you think it'll go, or who are you backing for it?
Yeah, so I should just say off the top, I don't vote for the finalists. I'm, as the president of the Football Reporters of Canada, I'm actually the deciding vote in the event of a tie. So
let's get some ties this year.
I can't,
all on your broad shoulders.
I can't issue 2 votes in that respect. So I didn't vote. I'm with you though. We're agreeing a lot here. Not for good radio podcasting, but it's the truth nonetheless.
Just good takes.
I'm with that one being a difficult one as far as, maybe what we perceived early on. Roland Milligan was obviously getting a lot of attention, particularly out of Saskatchewan for MOP, obviously battled with Brady Oliveira for that final designation. You could certainly make the argument if the awards setup was different than it is, and it allowed for, say, the top 3 players, regardless of what division you were in. You could probably make the argument that Roland Milligan is in that group just because of the fanfare he seemed to get from media and fans alike. But I'm with you. Like, look, for instance, Milligan, this is Defensive Player of the Year. So all of the 20 special teams tackles that he registered, which I believe were tied, he didn't finish first. I believe he finished tied for second in that category. Those don't count. Like those don't count in the Defensive Player of the Year award. That's a whole different phase. And where I feel like Roland Milligan will get the edge. And I don't want to get too much into voter psychology here, Huss, but I do think that voters might look at it and go, well, okay, Milligan didn't get the shot for MOP, therefore he should get most outstanding defensive player. So I'm not saying that will end up being the case. I would hope that the voters would look deep into the stats and not just look at a guy who garnered, arguably, for sure, in these parts of the country, more attention, and look at what Tyrese Beverette did, because Tyrese Beverette had an excellent season. As you mentioned, he led the entire league in defensive plays. He was a menace. He was forcing fumbles. He was registering sacks. He was a guy who was in on, I think he finished with 111 defensive tackles. So whenever you get over that century mark as a linebacker, that was the other thing I didn't understand with Roland Milligan. Mind you, Roland Milligan was hard on the ball, quick to the ball. There's no denying that when you watch the Riders play, this guy was everywhere and anywhere, but secondary tackles aren't viewed in the same way as linebacker tackles. So that's also at play. I think it is a toss-up. I do think that, you mentioned that Western bias. You'd have to imagine that exists on the East. We'll see what that can translate to for votes for Tyrese Beverette, but I wouldn't be surprised to see a close one in this one. I also wouldn't be surprised to see Roland Milligan run away with it.
The most outstanding Canadian is once again Brady Oliveira up against his teammate, or Beverette's teammate, Isaac Ayademi Berglund. Listen, just for Bergman's line for the year, 36 defensive tackles, 9 tackles for a loss, leading the league. Tops on the Alouettes with 7 sacks, 1 off the CFL lead. Had a great season. I just, by definition, if a guy's up for the most outstanding player and is Canadian, you would think he is that guy. But do voters go for Brady as the MOP and then toss the Canadian vote elsewhere?
I hope not, Huss. That would be awful. That makes no sense to me, that this person should get this award and this, let's be nice and hand this person this award. Look,
so
Berglund
is this a slam dunk, do you think?
It has to be. How is it not? This is, Berglund had a great season. There's no doubt about it. He, as you mentioned, the 7 sacks are even more impressive this year when you consider the leader. I think it was a 4-way tie or 3-way tie at 8. So he wasn't far off that lead and had a terrific year. Was the best defensive player on a really good Alouettes defense, right? And Alouettes defense, as I mentioned earlier in the show, was the bread and butter of Montreal's success this year. And it was going to be a big reason if and when they get to the Grey Cup, if they can get past Toronto. So, it's one of those things where you probably show up to the awards availability and you're kind of like, yeah, it's really, nice to have the recognition, and you still get the East win, right? You're still the East nominee. You just, when you look at where Brady is, what kind of season he had, and of course his place as likely to become the MOP in the league, it seems as close to a slam dunk as you can get.
Yeah, listen, a couple other nominees we'll just mention right now. The offensive lineman, Logan Ferland from the Riders, going up against the Argos horse, Ryan Hunter. The rookie of the year is Nick Anderson from Edmonton, up against Shamar Bridges of Hamilton. But the two I wanted to get your thoughts on, special teams player, Sean White with a near-perfect kicking season, going up against Janarian Grant, the return machine for the Toronto Argonauts, who is still missed in Winnipeg. And then Coach of the Year, Corey Mace versus Jason Moss. Quick thoughts on those two before we wrap.
Special teams, I'm going with Janarian Grant all day long. Sean White, great season as a kicker. Obviously a great percentage. If you can get into the 90s, you are automatic, as they like to say. So there's no taking away from Sean White's season. He was spectacular in a lot of different ways. Now to break it down, look, he's a kicker who doesn't have a long reach, right? Like his average kick, I believe, was under 30 yards, which just goes to show how many times he was doing chip shots. When you look at the BC Lions this year, I believe they had just as many, if not more, single converts as they did kicks inside the field goals inside the 40-yard line. So, and then add on the fact that Sean White kicks in the comfortable confines of BC Place with a roof, so you can control the atmosphere for every single one or half your season. And yeah, I mean, this is slam dunk to Janarian Grant. He's the most, no one's going to watch games to see how exciting Sean White's field goal kicks are, but people are left in awe when they see what Janarian Grant can do on any given return. So I think that one is a slam dunk.
What White is tasked to do is so different than something like Sergio Castillo. Like,
how about this? Not to interrupt you, Hassan, I'm sorry, but like, how about the fact that you have a guy swinging his foot like a golf club through games, and you have Janarian Grant, who is not a big guy, but might as well be 275 pounds and 6'3", the way he lowers his head and drives into traffic. Like, that alone should be the vote for Janarian Grant.
He's a human joystick. I was just going to say that, not all kickers are created equal, and while he's been money on short shots inside of a dome, I would love to see what the numbers would have been if he had to go out and attempt every kick in the same conditions that Mike O'Shea tasked Sergio Castillo with. And this is just some love for Sergio. An unbelievable year, breaking the record for 50-plus yarders. And listen, kickers get a lot of heat, but come this time of year, this weekend, there's going to be some very big plays with the kickers, but there's nobody that's a game breaker in special teams in the Canadian Football League like Janarian Grant. And I
never even answered your coach's question.
No, I was just about to say.
Sorry, I completely forgot.
Moss,
Mace, I think Mace deserves it. I do. Like, I just think when you look at, I was a bit curious about it, just slightly curious about it, that you could be a coach of the year and have a 7-game stretch where you couldn't get a win, right? An 18-game season. That being said, as someone who took a team who was 6-12 last year and rebounded them and was within one win away from winning the division, that is a massive turnaround. When you look at what he's been able to do with the culture of that team, improving the culture of that team. I know there was a couple incidents that were questionable this year, particularly against Winnipeg. So Bomber fans are not going to necessarily agree with that sentiment. However, you can see how the changes in that organization are palpable under Corey Mace. He dealt with a lot of injuries early on, very much like Mike O'Shea did. His O-line was battered. Their big free agent signing was Jamarcus Hardrick. We barely saw him this season. So he had to work with a lot, got the best out of Trevor Harris, a defense with the most takeaways, all those things, right? All those things that make teams really, really good. Corey Mace got his team to that. Jason Moss can certainly take a bow for his season. It's one of those things, right, where these awards are often looked at and compared to the previous year. So with Montreal winning the Grey Cup and then coming back in first place, I think it deserves more credit than it probably gets, right? You got to, you now have a target on your back, right? You come back as the reigning Grey Cup champions, and everyone's going to want to beat you. Everyone's going to view you as the standard, and you came out this season and you showed everybody that nothing's changed from the previous November, right? So definitely deserves a lot of credit. I just think it's probably going to be Corey Mace for just, everything I said and what he was able to do.
I listen, Coach of the Year award winners in whether it's the National Hockey League, football, it always seems to go to the guy that took over a team that sucked and made them respectable or good. Corey Mace absolutely did that, and I think he probably gets the benefit of the doubt. We'll find out all these award winners next week in Vancouver for Grey Cup week. Just before we go, heading over to our friends at Coolbet Canada. Here are your lines for the weekend. The Montreal Alouettes are 2-point favorites in the East Final against the Argos. Argos +2. The money line is Alouettes -139 and the Toronto Argonauts +115. Riders Bombers opened up at 4.5, relatively quickly moved to 3.5. That's where it's been for the last day or so. The Bombers are -217 favorites, and the Riders are +175 underdogs. Total in the Bomber Rider game is 48. Total in the Argos Alouettes game is 52. We have we got a big weekend coming up, Hammer, a big Saturday I cannot wait, and then a massive week next week when the league gathers in Vancouver for what should be a great Grey Cup week and a hell of a football game to see who's coming home with the trophy and planning a parade.
Christmas in November, man. It literally is Christmas in November. Anyone who loves and breathes and covers and all those things, the 3-down game, it's the place to be for a week. It's going to be in beautiful Vancouver this year, so weather won't be as big an issue as other locations. And yeah, just really looking forward to seeing you down there and doing the show live on location and just enjoying and soaking up all that is Grey Cup week. It really is a special week. If you haven't been, consider it. You might want to get on those flights, man. I've been checking them the last couple of days and ooh boy. But driving. Yeah, it will be a fun one. Right and you look Saturday. At these 4 teams too, Huss, like I really don't think there's a bad matchup. I don't think there's regardless of who comes out of the East and the West, it's going to be a good storyline. I know a lot of fans out there in Canada probably want to see the Bombers be downed. Finally, we'll see how that storybook finishes up this year. But yeah, lots of great storylines heading into this week, and lots of I'm sure we'll be breaking down what were 2 crazy games, Huss.
Yeah, listen, you can't win the Grey Cup if you don't get there. First things first, for Montreal, for Toronto, for Winnipeg and Saskatchewan, it's book that ticket to next week's Grey Cup in Vancouver. Programming note, because we are traveling Wednesday, in all likelihood, Thursday we'll do a big edition of CFL 110 from the Grey Cup Festival in Vancouver. Don't miss that. And of course, you can follow Jeff on X at Jeff K. Hamilton, read his work in the Winnipeg Free Press. We'll be doing live Winnipeg sports talk shows as well. So if you're just finding us on the channel or on YouTube at Sports Talk WPG, and make sure to subscribe to the channel. This is where you'll find it all. And of course, if you did find us on YouTube, the audio broadcast of CFL 110 available wherever you get your favorite podcasts. Just search CFL 110, add subscribe. Big thanks again to our great sponsors for CFL 110, Garage Living Winnipeg. Check out their website and all the amazing work they've done at garageliving.com. And in the Winnipeg and Manitoba area, give them a call, 204-999-1234 for a free in-garage consultation, or set up a meeting down at their showroom at 981 Main Street. For Jeff Hamilton and producer Michael Remus, I'm Andrew Paterson. We will see you next week in Vancouver at the Grey Cup. And in the meantime, enjoy what should be an incredible Saturday in the Canadian Football League.
You've been listening to CFL 110. Tune in next week for more great Canadian football discussion.